She almost hit me. I want her badge number.
I don't care. Give me your
What crime have I
ID.
committed? You're going to jail.
Obstruction.
Imagine this. You are driving down a busy suburban road on a Thursday afternoon. The sun is dipping toward the tree line, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. Traffic is moderate. You are in your lane, minding your own business, following every rule of the road. And then, without any warning whatsoever, a police cruiser swerves directly into your path. No turn signal, no lights flashing, no siren wailing. Just a 2-ton vehicle cutting across your lane so abruptly that you have to slam your brakes with everything you have. Your tires screech. Your seatbelt locks against your chest. Your heart hammers so hard you can feel it in your throat. You come to a stop inches from a collision that could have ended your life. Now imagine that after this happens, after this officer nearly kills you with her own recklessness, you get out of your car. You are shaking. You are furious. You are alive only because your reflexes saved you. You pull out your phone and start recording because you know that without evidence, your word means nothing against a badge. You ask the officer for her badge number. You tell her she almost ran you off the road, and she looks at you and she apologizes. She says she is sorry. She admits she did not see you. And then minutes later, you are in handcuffs. You are being arrested. You are being charged with a crime, not because you did anything wrong, not because you broke any law, but because you had the audacity to stand on a public sidewalk with a camera in your hand and demand accountability from someone who nearly took your life. This is the story of Marcus Trent, and what happened to him on a quiet suburban street in Ridgemont, Ohio, is one of the most disturbing examples of police retaliation caught on camera and later dismantled under oath in a federal deposition. If you care about knowing your rights, about understanding what police can and cannot do to you under the law, then stay with me through every minute of this story, because what these officers said under oath will leave you stunned, and the contradictions they could not escape will show you exactly how these situations unravel when the truth finally has its day. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of in-depth breakdown of real civil rights cases that keeps you informed, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Every new subscriber helps us bring these stories to light, and trust me, you are going to want to hear everything that comes next. Let us set the scene properly. Ridgemont is one of those inner-ring suburbs that clings to the eastern edge of a major metropolitan area in northeastern Ohio. It is not a small town, but it is not a sprawling city either. It sits in that in-between space where older residential neighborhoods meet commercial strips, where barber shops and family restaurants share sidewalks with auto repair garages and discount furniture stores. The population hovers around 45,000. The police department is mid-sized, maybe 80 or 90 sworn officers, enough to cover the community, but small enough that most officers know each other by name and shift preference. Oakfield Road is one of the main arteries that runs through the heart of Ridgemont. It is a 5-lane road, 2 lanes heading east, 2 heading west, and a shared center turn lane. During the afternoon hours, it fills up with commuters, delivery trucks, people heading to the grocery store, or picking up their kids from school. It is the kind of road where you need to be paying attention because things move fast and lane changes happen constantly. On Thursday, October 6th, 2022, at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, Officer Dana Prescott was on routine patrol in her marked Ridgemont Police Department cruiser. She was driving eastbound on Oakfield Road, positioned in the left travel lane. The sky was overcast with a gray blanket of clouds threatening rain, but not yet delivering it. The air had that autumn crispness to it, cool enough for a jacket, but not yet cold enough for a heavy coat. Trees lining the sidewalks had begun to turn, their leaves edging toward gold and rust. Officer Prescott had been with the Ridgemont Police Department for roughly 3 years at that point. She was still relatively early in her career, past the initial rookie jitters but not yet carrying the deep institutional weight that comes with a decade or more on the job. She was competent enough to handle routine patrol, and on this particular afternoon, her attention was fixed on something very specific. The previous day, Wednesday, there had been an incident in the area. Details from a report suggested that a dark gray Nissan sedan had been involved in suspicious activity. The specifics of that prior incident are not the focus of our story, but what matters is that Prescott had the vehicle description in her mind. Dark gray Nissan. She was looking for it. And then she spotted it, or at least she believed she did. Ahead of her, moving in the same eastbound direction but in the right curb lane, was a vehicle that matched the general description, a dark gray sedan. Her pulse quickened, her focus narrowed. Every bit of her attention tunneled toward that vehicle, and in that moment of hyperfocus, something critical fell away. Her awareness of everything else around her simply vanished. Marcus Trent was driving his dark blue Honda Accord eastbound on Oakfield Road, positioned in the right curb lane, exactly where he was supposed to be. He was heading home from running errands. The kind of unremarkable afternoon drive that 1 million Americans make every single day without incident. His windows were partially down despite the cool air because he liked the way autumn smelled in that part of Ohio, that mixture of damp leaves and wood smoke from somewhere far off. Marcus was 34 years old. He worked as a facilities coordinator for a commercial property management company. He was not a troublemaker. He was not a criminal. He was just a man driving home. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds in real time, but for Marcus, it unfolded with the slow-motion clarity that only genuine terror can produce. Officer Prescott, still in the left lane, made a decision to pursue the dark gray Nissan. But instead of checking her mirrors, instead of activating her turn signal, instead of ensuring the adjacent lane was clear, she simply cut the wheel to the right. Her cruiser lurched across the lane boundary and directly into the path of Marcus Trent's Honda. Marcus saw the cruiser materialize in his peripheral vision, like a wall appearing from nowhere. There was no warning, no blinking amber light, no wail of a siren rising in pitch. Just a police car suddenly occupying the space where he was already driving. His foot found the brake pedal with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from pure survival instinct. The Honda's anti-lock brakes engaged, the pedal pulsing under his foot as the tires fought for traction on the pavement. The car shuddered and skidded. Marcus was thrown forward against his seatbelt. The world outside the windshield blurred and then snapped back into focus as the Honda came to a screeching halt just feet from the cruiser's rear quarter panel. For a moment, Marcus just sat there. His hands were locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His chest heaved. The seatbelt had left a burning line across his collarbone where it had caught him. The sound of his own breathing filled the car, harsh and ragged against the sudden silence. He was alive. Barely. If his reflexes had been a fraction of a second slower, if he had been looking at his phone, if he had been changing the radio station, the front of his Honda would have buried itself into the side of that police cruiser at 35 miles an hour. The consequences of that impact for both of them could have been catastrophic. Now let us pause here and understand something crucial. What Officer Prescott did in that moment was, by any reasonable standard, reckless driving. She changed lanes without signaling, without checking, and without any awareness that another vehicle was occupying the space she was moving into. She later admitted all of this under oath. She did not see Marcus's car. She did not use her turn signal. She was focused entirely on the Nissan ahead of her, and everything else ceased to exist in her field of attention. The question of her emergency lights and siren would become a contested point. Prescott would later claim that she activated her overhead lights as she was transitioning into the lane. Marcus would firmly dispute this. He maintained that there were no lights, no siren, nothing until after the cruiser was already in front of him and pulling away. The body camera footage would add complexity to this dispute, but the core fact remained undeniable. Prescott nearly caused a serious accident through her own inattention. After the near collision, Prescott continued forward and initiated a traffic stop on the dark gray Nissan. The driver of that vehicle was a man named Raymond Fletcher. Fletcher pulled over to the right side of Oakfield Road and stopped. Prescott positioned her cruiser behind his vehicle, activated her full array of emergency lights, and prepared to make contact with Fletcher. Meanwhile, Marcus Trent sat in his Honda, still processing what had just happened. His hands were trembling. That cold, electric feeling of an adrenaline surge was coursing through his body. He could feel it in his fingertips, in the slight shake of his jaw, in the way his vision seemed sharper than normal, every detail hyper-vivid. The near miss replayed in his mind on a loop. The cruiser cutting in front of him, the screech of his tires, the violent jolt of the seatbelt catching his body. And then something shifted inside him. The fear began to harden into anger, not the wild, uncontrolled anger that leads to bad decisions, but the focused, righteous kind. The kind that comes when you realize someone who is supposed to protect you just endangered your life through pure carelessness. And that without proof, without evidence, without a record, nothing would ever come of it. Marcus reached for his phone. He opened the camera app, and he got out of his car. This decision, this simple act of stepping out of his vehicle with a phone in his hand, would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to a federal courthouse sworn depositions, and the exposure of exactly how fragile the relationship between police power and citizen rights can be when ego enters the equation. Marcus walked forward on the sidewalk toward where Prescott had stopped the Nissan. He was not in the road. He was not blocking anything. He was on the public sidewalk, a space where any citizen has an absolute right to stand. He kept his phone raised, the camera recording. His voice was firm but not screaming when he called out to Officer Prescott. He wanted her badge number. He wanted to know her name. He told her clearly and directly that she had almost run him off the road, that she had nearly caused an accident, that he wanted this documented. And here is where something important happened. Officer Prescott, to her initial credit, responded in a way that was almost reasonable. She told Marcus to hold on. She indicated she was in the middle of conducting a traffic stop on Fletcher's vehicle and could not engage with him at that exact moment. She asked him to wait, and Marcus complied. He stopped advancing. He stood on the sidewalk. He kept his camera rolling, but he waited, exactly as she asked. Think about this for a moment. Marcus did everything right. He was upset, justifiably so, but he followed her instructions. He stopped when told to stop. He waited when asked to wait. He stayed on public property. He exercised his constitutional right to record a police officer performing her duties in a public space. Every single thing he did was lawful. Every single thing he did was within his rights. After a brief period, Prescott walked back toward Marcus, and she did something that, in the moment, seemed like it might lead to a reasonable resolution. She apologized to him. She acknowledged that she had nearly hit him. She expressed regret for the close call, standing there on the sidewalk of Oakfield Road with the gray October sky above them and the traffic rolling past. It seemed for a fleeting moment like this might end the way it should have ended, with an apology, an exchange of information, and two people going their separate ways. But that moment evaporated almost as quickly as it had appeared, because despite the apology, despite acknowledging her own fault, Officer Dana Prescott picked up her radio and called dispatch. And what she said into that radio would reveal the true direction this encounter was about to take. She requested backup, and the reason she gave was not that she needed help with the Fletcher traffic stop. It was not that she was in danger. The reason she transmitted over the airwaves was that, and these are the essential words, another party did not know how to yield to emergency signals and was now standing there recording her. Let that sink in for a moment. She had just admitted to Marcus that she nearly hit him. She had just apologized, and now, on a recorded radio transmission, she was reframing the entire narrative. She was not the officer who had recklessly cut off a civilian. She was the officer dealing with a difficult civilian who did not yield to her lights and sirens. She was not the one who owed an explanation. She was the one who needed backup because someone was filming her. This is what retaliation looks like when it happens in real time. It does not always come with shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes in the form of a calm radio transmission that subtly poisons the well for every officer who will respond. Sometimes it comes in the form of rewriting the story before the story is even finished. And the person who answered that call for backup was Sergeant Victor Galindo. Sergeant Galindo arrived on scene within minutes. He pulled his cruiser up to the location and stepped out with the kind of purposeful stride that immediately communicated authority and control. Galindo had been with the Ridgemont Department for roughly 9 years. He carried himself with the confidence of a supervisor who was accustomed to taking charge of situations and not accustomed to being questioned by anyone, least of all a civilian standing on a sidewalk with a cell phone. What Galindo did not do, and this would become a devastating point in the subsequent legal proceedings, was ask Prescott what had actually happened before engaging with Marcus. He did not pull her aside for a quick briefing. He did not say, "What's going on here? What led up to this?" He simply arrived, assessed the visual scene, saw a civilian with a camera near a traffic stop, and made his judgments instantaneously. He approached Marcus directly, and from the very first words out of his mouth, the tone was accusatory. Galindo told Marcus that he could not pull up behind an officer at a traffic stop. This was a factual misrepresentation of what had occurred. Marcus had not pulled up behind anyone. Marcus had been cut off by Prescott's reckless lane change and had come to a forced stop. He did not choose to be there. He did not seek out the traffic stop. He was put in that position by the officer's own dangerous driving. But Galindo did not know this, or perhaps he did not care to know it. He had already constructed his version of events based on Prescott's radio call, and that version cast Marcus as the problem. What followed was an escalating confrontation that Marcus tried repeatedly to de-escalate through the only tool available to him, asking questions and asserting his rights. Galindo demanded that Marcus identify himself. He wanted Marcus's name. He wanted his identification. And Marcus, who understood his rights with a clarity that clearly surprised both officers, asked the question that sits at the very foundation of this entire case. What crime have I committed? It is a simple question, 7 words, but those 7 words carry the full weight of constitutional law behind them. Because in the state of Ohio and in the federal circuit that governs Ohio, the law is unambiguous on this point. A citizen is only required to provide identification to a police officer when that officer is conducting a lawful investigation and has reasonable articulable suspicion that the citizen has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a specific crime. Marcus was not suspected of any crime. He had not been accused of any crime. He was standing on a public sidewalk recording a public servant performing public duties. There was no legal basis, none whatsoever, for demanding his identification. And this is where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Because instead of recognizing the legal reality of the situation, instead of stepping back and reassessing, Sergeant Galindo doubled down. He told Marcus that if he did not identify himself, he would be arrested for obstruction. Now, the obstruction statute in Ohio, like similar statutes in many states, has been the subject of extensive litigation. Courts at the federal appellate level have ruled clearly and repeatedly on how this statute interacts with the citizen's duty to identify themselves. The holdings are consistent. If an officer is not investigating you for a crime, if there is no reasonable articulable suspicion that you have done something illegal, then your refusal to provide your name does not constitute obstruction. It cannot, because you have no legal obligation to identify yourself in the first place, and you cannot obstruct something that has no lawful basis to compel you. Marcus seemed to understand this. He asked Galindo directly, "What is your reasonable articulable suspicion? What crime are you investigating me for?" And Galindo could not answer because there was no answer to give. Marcus had committed no crime. He had violated no law. He was exercising his rights, but the sergeant was not interested in the law at that point. He was interested in control. I want you to pause and think about what this felt like from Marcus's perspective. You are standing on a public sidewalk. You've done nothing wrong. An officer nearly killed you with her own carelessness minutes ago, and she admitted it. And now a supervisor is standing in front of you, telling you that if you do not hand over your identification, something you have no legal obligation to do, you are going to be placed under arrest. The power imbalance is staggering. You know your rights. You know the law is on your side. But the man in front of you has a badge, a gun, handcuffs, and the institutional authority to physically restrain you and take you to jail regardless of whether the charges will stick. The law might vindicate you eventually, but in this moment, on this sidewalk, the law is abstract. The handcuffs are real. If you have ever wondered what you would do in a situation like this, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you hand over your ID to make it go away? Would you stand your ground knowing an arrest might follow? There is no easy answer, and that is exactly what makes this situation so deeply troubling. During this confrontation, something remarkable happened, and it happened on camera, captured by body-worn recording equipment that would later become pivotal evidence. Officer Prescott, who was still present during the exchange between Galindo and Marcus, said something directly to Marcus. She told him plainly and clearly that there was no crime. There is no crime. Those words, spoken by the officer who had initiated the entire encounter, who had been the one to call for backup, who had first-hand knowledge of everything that had transpired, cut through the tension like a blade, because if there was no crime, then there was no legal basis for demanding identification. And if there was no legal basis for demanding identification, then refusing to provide it could not possibly constitute obstruction. Prescott's own words destroyed the foundation of the arrest before the arrest even happened. And yet, the arrest happened anyway. Sergeant Galindo placed Marcus Trent in handcuffs. The arrest was physical. Marcus, whose hands were being wrenched behind his back, asked Galindo a question that conveyed both pain and disbelief. He asked if Galindo was going to break his wrists. The cuffing was aggressive enough that Marcus felt genuine physical distress, and as Galindo secured the handcuffs, he made a verbal assertion that Marcus was resisting. He stated, for the record of the body camera, that Marcus was physically resisting the arrest. This claim would later be demolished in the most authoritative way possible, not by Marcus's attorney, not by a judge, but by Officer Prescott herself. When Prescott was placed under oath months later during her formal deposition in the federal lawsuit that followed, she was asked directly whether Marcus Trent had physically resisted arrest in any way. Her answer was unequivocal. No, He did not resist, not at all, not in any manner. Galindo's claim of resistance was, according to the testimony of his own subordinate officer who witnessed the entire arrest from feet away, entirely fabricated. With Marcus now handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol vehicle, a conversation occurred between Galindo and Prescott that would become some of the most damning evidence in the entire case. This conversation, captured on recording equipment, revealed the machinery of a wrongful arrest being assembled in real time. Galindo essentially told Prescott that they needed to charge Marcus with something. The man was in handcuffs. He was in the back of a cruiser. There needed to be a charge to justify what had already been done. This is the tail wagging the dog. This is the arrest coming first, and the reason being manufactured afterward. It is the inversion of everything the justice system is supposed to represent. And Prescott's response to Galindo was extraordinary in its honesty. She told her sergeant that she was fine with letting Marcus go. She said that he just did not understand. She expressed no desire to see him charged. She saw no justification for what was happening. But Galindo overruled her. He stated that Marcus was already in handcuffs. He asserted that Marcus had obstructed their duties. He pointed to the refusal to identify as the basis for the charge. And he directed Prescott, as her supervisor, to write the citation. Think about the dynamics at play here. A junior officer, roughly 3 years on the job, is being told by her sergeant to write a citation that she does not believe is justified for an arrest she did not want to happen against a man she herself had told there was no crime. She is caught between her own conscience and the chain of command, between what she knows is right and what her supervisor is ordering her to do. And she wrote the citation. She followed orders. She put her name on a document charging Marcus Trent with obstruction of official business, even though she knew, in her own words, that there was no crime, even though she had told Marcus as much to his face, even though she did not believe the charge had any merit. This is how the system fails. Not always through malice at every level, but through the corrosive power of hierarchy and the reluctance of individuals to challenge authority, even when authority is clearly wrong. Prescott was not the villain who orchestrated this arrest, but she was the officer who could have stopped it and did not. She could have called her shift lieutenant. She could have told Galindo firmly and on the record that there was no probable cause. She could have refused to sign a citation she believed was baseless. She did none of these things. When asked in her deposition why she did not call a higher-ranking officer to intervene, Prescott's answer was quietly devastating. She said the thought simply had not occurred to her. In the moment, facing her sergeant's direct order, the idea of going above his head to protect a citizen's rights did not even enter her mind. That answer tells us something profound about the culture of policing, about the way rank and authority can override individual judgment, and about how easily a person's freedom can be sacrificed on the altar of institutional conformity. Prescott was not a bad person in the conventional sense. She was an officer who lacked the moral courage to defy an unjust order, and in the field of civil rights, that absence of courage is its own form of complicity. Marcus Trent was transported and processed. He was charged with obstruction of official business. A man who had been minding his own business, driving home on a Thursday afternoon, who had been nearly killed by a reckless police officer who had done nothing more than stand on a sidewalk and ask for a badge number, was now a criminal defendant. But the story does not end at the jailhouse door. It rarely does when the charges are this hollow. Approximately 4 days after the arrest, the citation and accompanying documentation landed on the desk of a municipal prosecutor in Ridgemont. Prosecutors serve as a critical checkpoint in the justice system. They review the evidence, assess whether probable cause exists, and decide whether to move forward with charges. A good prosecutor does not simply rubber stamp whatever the police bring in. A good prosecutor evaluates, and this prosecutor evaluated Marcus Trent's case and found nothing. No probable cause, no legitimate basis for the charge. The obstruction citation was dismissed, just like that. 4 days after Marcus was handcuffed on a public sidewalk for exercising his constitutional rights, the legal system itself acknowledged that there was no crime. Prescott had told Marcus there was no crime on the day it happened. The prosecutor confirmed it less than a week later, but a dismissal does not undo the arrest. It does not erase the humiliation of being handcuffed in public. It does not reverse the physical pain of having your wrists wrenched behind your back. It does not delete the booking photograph or the arrest record. It does not give back the hours spent in custody or the money spent on an attorney. And it certainly does not address the underlying abuse of power that caused all of it in the first place. Marcus Trent needed more than a dismissal. He needed accountability. And that is where attorney Nathan Cross entered the picture. Cross was a civil rights litigator operating in the northeastern Ohio area, a lawyer who had built his practice around exactly these kinds of cases where citizens were wrongfully arrested, where police officers overstepped their authority, where constitutional rights were trampled under the boot of unchecked power. He took Marcus's case and filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983 of the United States Code in the Federal District Court, covering the Ridgemont area. For those unfamiliar with this area of law, Section 1983 is the primary legal tool that allows citizens to sue government officials, including police officers who violate their constitutional rights while acting under the color of state authority. It is the mechanism through which the abstract promises of the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment become enforceable in a courtroom. Without it, officers who abuse their power would face no personal consequences for their actions. The lawsuit named both Officer Dana Prescott and Sergeant Victor Galindo as defendants. The claims centered on false arrest in violation of the Fourth Amendment, First Amendment retaliation for Marcus's exercise of his right to record and to voice complaints, and excessive force during the handcuffing. And then came the depositions. The sworn, recorded, legally binding depositions where both officers had to sit across a table from an attorney, raise their right hand, and answer questions under oath. No radio transmissions to frame the narrative, no supervisor to hide behind, no qualified immunity to shield them from the questions themselves, just an officer, an attorney, and the truth. The deposition of Officer Dana Prescott was conducted in a conference room at a law office. The setting was mundane in the way that legal proceedings often are. Fluorescent lighting, a long table, water pitchers, a court reporter with a stenography machine, a video camera positioned to capture Prescott's face and upper body. Attorney Cross sat across from her, organized, methodical, and thoroughly prepared. What unfolded over the course of that deposition was a systematic dismantling of every justification for Marcus Trent's arrest, not through confrontation or theatrics, but through the quiet, relentless power of direct questions that demanded direct answers. Cross started with the near collision. He walked Prescott through the events on Oakfield Road step by step. And Prescott, under oath, confirmed what Marcus had said from the beginning. She acknowledged that she had been in the left lane. She confirmed that Marcus was in the right lane. She admitted that she changed lanes to pursue the Nissan. And when Cross asked whether she had activated her turn signal before making that lane change, Prescott said no, she had not. When asked whether she had seen Marcus's vehicle before cutting into his lane, Prescott again said no, she had not seen him. She was focused entirely on the gray Nissan and did not check the adjacent lane before moving into it. These admissions alone were significant. An officer of the law operating a marked police vehicle had changed lanes on a busy suburban road without signaling and without checking for other vehicles. This is the kind of driving that would result in a citation for any civilian. It is the kind of driving that could, and nearly did, cause a serious accident. Cross then moved to the aftermath. He asked Prescott about Marcus's behavior when he exited his vehicle, and here, Prescott's testimony painted a picture of a man who was angry but compliant. She confirmed that when she told Marcus to wait, he waited. When she asked him to move to the sidewalk, he moved to the sidewalk. He followed every instruction she gave. Cross asked whether Marcus had at any point prevented her from conducting the traffic stop on Raymond Fletcher. Prescott considered the question. She acknowledged that at one brief moment she had glanced toward Marcus when he called out to her, but this glance, this momentary diversion of her attention, lasted approximately 1 second. And during that single second, she never stopped walking toward Fletcher's vehicle. She never halted the traffic stop. She never lost control of the situation. The investigation proceeded without interruption. 1 second. That was the sum total of the so-called obstruction. A single second during which an officer turned her head to look at a man on the sidewalk while continuing to walk forward. No reasonable person could characterize this as obstruction of anything. It is the kind of incidental human interaction that occurs thousands of times a day in every city in America without anyone dreaming of calling it a crime. Cross pressed further. He asked Prescott about her statement to Marcus that there was no crime. This was a critical moment in the deposition because that statement, captured on body camera, was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case. Prescott confirmed that she had told Marcus there was no crime. When asked whether this statement was truthful, Prescott's answer became complicated and evasive, but the essential reality was inescapable. She had told a citizen there was no crime being investigated, and then that citizen had been arrested for obstructing an investigation into a crime that, by her own admission, did not exist. The logical contradiction was devastating. You cannot obstruct an investigation that is not happening. You cannot be compelled to identify yourself in connection with a crime that no one is investigating. And you certainly cannot be arrested for refusing to comply with an unlawful demand. Cross then turned to the arrest itself. He asked Prescott whether Marcus had physically resisted being handcuffed. Her answer was direct and unambiguous. No, Marcus did not resist. He did not pull away. He did not tense his body. He did not struggle. Galindo's on-scene claim that Marcus was resisting was contradicted entirely by the eyewitness testimony of the only other officer present. This is an important point that deserves emphasis. When a police officer claims a suspect is resisting arrest, that claim often serves a dual purpose. It provides justification for the use of additional force during the arrest, and it creates an additional charge that can be leveled against the suspect. If the arrest itself was unlawful, then claiming resistance adds a layer of cover. It shifts the narrative from "we arrested an innocent man" to "we arrested a man who was fighting us." But when your own partner, under oath, says the suspect was not resisting in any way, that cover evaporates entirely. Cross also explored the conversation between Galindo and Prescott after Marcus was placed in the cruiser, the conversation where Galindo directed Prescott to write the citation. Prescott confirmed the substance of this exchange. She confirmed that she had expressed willingness to let Marcus go. She confirmed that she had said Marcus simply did not understand the situation. She confirmed that Galindo had overridden her judgment and directed her to file the charge. When asked why she complied with an order she disagreed with, Prescott explained that Galindo was her sergeant. He was her supervisor. He had given her a direct instruction, and she had followed it. The chain of command in her mind superseded her own assessment of the situation. Cross asked whether she had considered calling her shift lieutenant, a higher-ranking officer who could have intervened and potentially overridden Galindo's decision. Prescott said the thought had not occurred to her. In the moment, with her sergeant standing in front of her giving direct orders, the idea of going up the chain did not cross her mind. One of the most telling exchanges in the entire deposition came when Cross asked Prescott about the purpose requirement in Ohio's obstruction statute. The law requires that for a person to be guilty of obstruction, they must have acted with the specific purpose of hampering or impeding a police officer in the performance of their duties, not incidentally, not accidentally, but purposefully. Cross asked Prescott what she believed Marcus's purpose was when he exited his vehicle and approached the scene. Prescott's answer was devastating to any prosecution. She said she did not know what his purpose was. She could not state that his purpose was to obstruct, hamper, or impede anything. From her observation, his purpose appeared to be exactly what he had stated out loud. He wanted her badge number because she had almost caused an accident. Without the purpose element, the obstruction charge collapses entirely. It is not merely weak. It ceases to exist as a legal matter, and the officer who wrote the citation acknowledged, under oath, that she could not establish the most fundamental element of the crime she had charged. Cross asked Prescott about the body camera footage. He asked whether the footage accurately captured what had occurred. Prescott acknowledged that it did. She affirmed that the recording equipment does not have an agenda. It captures what happens. And what it captured in this case was a man who did nothing wrong being arrested by officers who had no legal basis to arrest him. Near the conclusion of Prescott's deposition, Cross asked a series of questions that cut to the heart of the matter. He asked whether Prescott disagreed with the prosecutor's decision to dismiss the charges. She said she did not disagree. She accepted the dismissal. He asked whether Marcus Trent had been the subject of the Fletcher traffic stop. She said no. Marcus was not the person being investigated. He was not a suspect in anything. He was a bystander. He asked whether Marcus's frustration on the day in question was understandable. Prescott said yes. His frustration was justified. She had nearly caused an accident, and his reaction was a natural human response. And then, in a moment that encapsulated the contradictions woven throughout her testimony, Cross asked Prescott whether she believed Marcus Trent's rights had been violated. And Prescott said no. This answer hung in the air of that conference room like smoke. She had testified that Marcus committed no crime, that she told him there was no crime, that he complied with every instruction, that he did not resist arrest, that she did not want to write the citation, that the charge had no merit, that the prosecutor was right to dismiss it. And yet somehow, she maintained that his rights had not been violated. It was the final act of institutional loyalty overriding personal honesty. The admission that would have mattered most, the acknowledgement that what happened to Marcus was wrong at a constitutional level, was the one admission she could not bring herself to make. Perhaps because making it would mean confronting the full weight of her own complicity. Perhaps because it would mean admitting that she had been part of something that should never have happened. Whatever the reason, the jury in the federal case would eventually have to reconcile this denial with every other word Prescott had spoken under oath, and the reconciliation would not be kind to her. Now let me ask you something. Based on everything you have heard so far about Officer Prescott's testimony, do you think she was a genuinely bad officer or someone who got caught in a system that rewarded compliance over conscience? It is a question worth sitting with, and I would love to hear your perspective in the comments below, because what comes next, the deposition of Sergeant Victor Galindo, takes this story into even darker territory. If Prescott's testimony was a slow unraveling, Galindo's was a masterclass in defiance. Where Prescott showed flashes of honesty even as she tried to protect herself, Galindo showed something else entirely. He showed a man who believed, truly and deeply, that he had done nothing wrong. And that belief, held in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, revealed more about the culture of unchecked authority than any policy manual ever could. Galindo's deposition was conducted in the same general setting. A conference room, a court reporter, a video camera, attorney Nathan Cross sitting across the table with the same calm, methodical energy he had brought to Prescott's examination. But the dynamic was different from the start. Where Prescott had been somewhat cooperative, if evasive at times, Galindo carried himself with a rigidity that bordered on contempt for the process. He sat upright in his chair, shoulders squared, jaw set. His answers were clipped and often combative. He did not volunteer information. He challenged the framing of questions. He pushed back on premises that any reasonable observer would consider established fact. And in doing so, he painted a portrait of himself that was far more damaging than anything Marcus Trent's attorney could have painted alone. Cross began with the basics. He established Galindo's rank, his years of service, his role on the day in question. Galindo confirmed that he had been the patrol sergeant on duty when he received Prescott's radio call requesting backup. He confirmed that he responded to the scene. And then Cross began asking about what Galindo knew, and when he knew it, before he ever made contact with Marcus Trent. This line of questioning would prove to be one of the most consequential threads in the entire deposition, because what emerged was a picture of a supervisor who arrived on scene with a conclusion already formed and made no effort whatsoever to gather facts before acting on it. Cross asked Galindo whether, upon arriving at the scene, he had spoken with Officer Prescott to determine what had led to the situation. Galindo's answer was no. He had not asked Prescott for a briefing. He had not pulled her aside. He had not requested the basic who, what, where, when, and why that any competent supervisor should obtain before inserting themselves into an active situation. He simply saw a civilian near a traffic stop, heard Prescott's radio characterization, and decided that the civilian was the problem. The investigation of what had actually happened, the near collision, Prescott's admission of fault, Marcus's compliance with instructions, none of it entered Galindo's decision-making process because he never bothered to ask. This is not just bad policing. It is the kind of reflexive, assumption-driven response that leads directly to constitutional violations. A supervisor's job is not to show up and immediately take sides. A supervisor's job is to assess, to gather information, to make informed decisions. Galindo did none of this. He walked into a situation he did not understand and began issuing demands backed by the threat of arrest. Cross pressed Galindo on his initial statement to Marcus, the assertion that Marcus had pulled up behind an officer at a traffic stop. Cross pointed out that this was not what had happened. Marcus had not chosen to position himself near the traffic stop. He had been cut off by Prescott's lane change and forced to stop. His presence near the scene was a direct result of Prescott's own reckless driving, not any voluntary action on Marcus's part. Galindo's response was telling. He did not concede the point. He deflected. He reframed. He clung to his version of events despite the fact that his own officer had already testified under oath that the lane change was unsignaled and that she had not seen Marcus's vehicle. Galindo's narrative required Marcus to be the aggressor, the interloper, the problem, and he was unwilling to abandon that narrative, even when it was contradicted by the testimony of the officer he was supposed to be supervising. Cross moved to the demand for identification. He asked Galindo to explain the legal basis for requiring Marcus to provide his name and identification. This should have been straightforward. If Galindo had a lawful basis, he could state it. If he did not, the entire arrest was constitutionally indefensible. Galindo asserted that Marcus was required to identify himself because he was interfering with a police investigation, but when Cross asked him to specify how Marcus was interfering, the specifics evaporated. Marcus was on the sidewalk. Marcus was not touching anyone or anything related to the traffic stop. Marcus was not physically blocking access to Fletcher's vehicle. Marcus was not shouting so loudly that Prescott could not communicate. Marcus was holding a phone and recording, which is a constitutionally protected activity. The interference that Galindo described was, at its core, nothing more than Marcus's presence and his refusal to be silent. And neither presence nor speech on a public sidewalk constitutes interference with a police investigation in any legal sense. Cross then confronted Galindo with the specific legal framework governing Ohio's obstruction statute and the duty to identify. He referenced the appellate decisions from the Federal Circuit Court that oversees Ohio, decisions that clearly and unambiguously hold that Ohio's obstruction statute does not create a duty to identify oneself to police, absent reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. These are not obscure rulings buried in dusty law libraries. These are binding precedents that every law enforcement officer in Ohio should know. Galindo's response to this legal framework was perhaps the most revealing moment of his entire deposition. When confronted with the fact that the city prosecutor had reviewed Marcus's case and dismissed it for lack of probable cause, Cross asked Galindo whether he agreed with that decision, and Galindo said no. He disagreed with the prosecutor's dismissal. Let that settle for a moment. A patrol sergeant, a law enforcement officer whose training in criminal law consists of academy instruction and periodic in-service updates, was sitting in a sworn deposition declaring that he knew the law better than the licensed attorney whose professional responsibility it was to evaluate criminal charges. The prosecutor, who had reviewed the evidence and the applicable law and determined that no crime had been committed, was wrong in Galindo's estimation. The sergeant, who had not bothered to ask his own officer what happened before making an arrest, was confident that his legal analysis was superior to that of a trained prosecutor. This was not confidence. It was arrogance operating in a vacuum of self-awareness. And it is exactly the kind of arrogance that leads to citizens being handcuffed on sidewalks for the crime of asking questions. Cross also explored what happened after the arrest, and this is where the deposition ventured into territory that raised serious concerns about institutional accountability within the Ridgemont Police Department. It emerged during questioning that Galindo had been the subject of an internal affairs investigation related to the incident involving Marcus Trent. The department had, at some point after the lawsuit was filed or the charges were dismissed, initiated a review of Galindo's conduct. Disciplinary proceedings had followed. Cross asked Galindo about a meeting that had taken place after the incident, a meeting that occurred not in the police station, not in a supervisor's office, not in any official departmental setting. This meeting took place in a parking lot, and not just any parking lot. It was described as a location that was understood among certain officers to be a place where conversations happened off the record. A designated off-the-record parking lot. Consider what that phrase implies. It implies that members of the Ridgemont Police Department had an established, understood location where they could discuss matters without those discussions being documented, recorded, or subject to departmental oversight. It implies a shadow channel of communication that existed parallel to, and deliberately outside of, official accountability structures. What was discussed in that parking lot, and between whom, became a subject of deposition questioning. The full details of those conversations were not entirely fleshed out in the portion of testimony covered here, but the mere existence of such a meeting and the acknowledgement that it took place in a location specifically chosen to avoid documentation raised profound questions about transparency and accountability within the department. Galindo also made an admission during his deposition that, while seemingly minor in isolation, spoke volumes about his conduct during the encounter with Marcus. He acknowledged that he had been discourteous and disrespectful to Marcus Trent. In a profession where officers routinely justify harsh language and aggressive demeanor as necessary tools for maintaining control of a scene, an outright admission of discourtesy is rare. Galindo apparently could not deny what the body camera footage clearly showed. Whatever words he used with Marcus, whatever tone he adopted, it was bad enough that even he could not characterize it as professional. This admission, paired with his insistence that the arrest was justified, created a portrait of a man who recognized his own rudeness, but could not recognize his own lawlessness. He could see that he had been impolite. He could not see that he had violated someone's constitutional rights. The small transgression was visible to him. The enormous one was not. Cross also asked Galindo about certain individuals within the department. He mentioned a Detective Harrison, whom Galindo described as an honest person. He then asked about a Detective Johansson, and Galindo's response shifted. He declined to characterize Johansson's honesty one way or the other. This exchange, while brief, suggested internal tensions within the department that extended beyond the Marcus Trent case itself. When a sergeant will readily vouch for one detective's integrity, but refuses to do the same for another, it hints at fissures, alliances, and conflicts within the organization that may have influenced how the Trent situation was handled and investigated after the fact. The contrast between Prescott's deposition and Galindo's could not have been more stark. Prescott, for all her failures of courage on the day of the arrest, showed moments of genuine honesty under oath. She admitted her driving error. She confirmed Marcus's compliance. She acknowledged that she did not want to write the citation. She agreed with the prosecutor's dismissal. Her testimony was damaging to the defense of both officers precisely because she could not bring herself to lie about the fundamental facts. Galindo, by contrast, seemed to exist in an alternate reality where his actions were justified, the prosecutor was wrong, and the citizen who was arrested for doing nothing was somehow the author of his own misfortune. His deposition was not the testimony of a man grappling with a mistake. It was the testimony of a man who refused to acknowledge that a mistake had been made at all. And this refusal, this absolute unwillingness to concede error, is perhaps the most dangerous quality a law enforcement officer can possess. An officer who makes a mistake and recognizes it can learn from it, can grow, can be corrected. An officer who makes a mistake and insists it was not a mistake will make the same mistake again, and again, and again, until the institutional structures around him either force a change or collapse under the weight of the consequences. Let us take a wider lens for a moment and consider what the Marcus Trent case tells us about the systemic dynamics at play in encounters like these. First, there is the issue of retaliation. Marcus was arrested not because he committed a crime, but because he challenged authority. He asked for a badge number. He recorded the encounter. He demanded accountability. These are not criminal acts. They are the acts of a citizen exercising the rights that the Constitution guarantees. But in the field, in the moment, on the street, those rights can feel like provocations to officers who are not accustomed to being questioned. The call for backup was the first act of retaliation. Prescott did not call for help because she was in danger. She called because a man was filming her and asking uncomfortable questions. The framing of that radio call, the characterization of Marcus as someone who did not know how to yield to emergency signals, was designed to prejudice every responding officer against Marcus before they ever laid eyes on him. It worked. Galindo arrived with his mind already made up. Second, there is the issue of the identification demand. Across the country, citizens are routinely told by police officers that they must identify themselves. In some states, under specific circumstances, this is true. But the legal requirements vary dramatically from state to state and from situation to situation, and the gap between what officers believe the law requires and what the law actually requires is often vast. In Ohio, the law is clear. You must identify yourself when you are being investigated for a crime. If you are not a suspect, if there is no reasonable suspicion that you have done anything illegal, you have no obligation to provide your name, your identification, or any other personal information. Marcus knew this. The prosecutor knew this. The federal courts know this. The only people who seemed not to know it or not to care about it were the two officers who arrested Marcus for asserting exactly this right. Third, there is the issue of the chain of command. Prescott knew the arrest was wrong. She said so, or as close to saying so as someone in her position could manage. She told Galindo she was willing to let Marcus go. She indicated there was no basis for the charge, and Galindo overrode her. He ordered her to write the citation, and she complied. This dynamic is not unique to this case. It plays out in police departments across the country every day. Junior officers who recognize that something is wrong but do not feel empowered to challenge their superiors. Supervisors who prioritize authority over accuracy. A culture that treats questioning the chain of command as a form of insubordination rather than a form of integrity. Prescott could have called the shift lieutenant. She could have said, on the record, that she did not believe probable cause existed. She could have refused to sign the citation. Any of these actions might have prevented Marcus from being charged, but doing any of them would have required her to challenge her sergeant directly. And the institutional culture of policing made that challenge feel impossible, even though it was entirely lawful. And this brings us to the final and perhaps most important theme of this story: the role of documentation and accountability mechanisms in protecting citizens from abuse. Without body camera footage, this case would have been Marcus Trent's word against two officers. And in that contest, history tells us repeatedly and unambiguously the officers almost always win. The body cameras captured Prescott's apology. They captured her admission that there was no crime. They captured Galindo's aggressive demeanor and his failure to investigate before acting. They captured Marcus's compliance with every instruction. They captured the post-arrest conversation where Galindo directed Prescott to write a citation she did not believe in. Without the federal civil rights lawsuit, the charges would have been dismissed, and that would have been the end of it. Marcus would have walked away with an arrest on his record, a story no one believed, and no recourse. The lawsuit forced both officers into depositions where they had to answer questions under oath, where contradictions could not be hidden, where the gap between what happened on that sidewalk and what should have happened was exposed in granular, undeniable detail. And without citizens like Marcus who are willing to endure the indignity, the physical discomfort, the legal expense, and the emotional toll of fighting back, these cases never come to light. For every Marcus Trent who files a lawsuit, there are dozens of people who accept the dismissal, absorb the humiliation, and move on because they do not have the resources, the knowledge, or the energy to seek accountability. The cases we hear about are the tip of an iceberg that extends deep beneath the surface of the justice system. As of the recording of this account, the federal civil rights lawsuit filed on behalf of Marcus Trent remains pending in the federal courthouse. These cases move slowly. Discovery takes months. Depositions are scheduled and rescheduled. Motions are filed and argued. Summary judgment briefs are written. Settlement negotiations may occur behind closed doors. And if no settlement is reached, a trial date is set, often years after the original incident. The wheels of justice grind slowly, as the saying goes, but they grind. And sometimes, when the evidence is strong enough and the legal arguments are sound enough, they grind down even the most stubborn defenses. Sergeant Galindo faces a particularly difficult path forward. His refusal to agree with the prosecutor's dismissal, his admission of discourteous behavior, his failure to investigate before acting, his participation in an off-the-record meeting at a designated unofficial location, and his direct order to a subordinate to file a charge that the subordinate did not believe was justified. All of this creates a picture that no jury is likely to find sympathetic. The defense will almost certainly raise qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields government officials from civil liability unless their conduct violated clearly established constitutional rights. But in this case, the clearly established law is firmly on Marcus's side. The federal circuit court that governs Ohio has ruled explicitly and repeatedly that Ohio's obstruction statute does not create a duty to identify oneself absent reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity. Any officer who attended a legal update training in the past decade should know this. The argument that Galindo could not have known he was violating Marcus's rights is extraordinarily difficult to sustain when the law is this settled and this clear. Prescott's situation is complicated in a different way. She was not the decision-maker who ordered the arrest. She did not initiate the confrontation with Marcus after the initial near-collision encounter. In many ways, she was caught between her own judgment and her sergeant's orders. But she was the one who wrote the citation. She was the one who signed her name to a charge she knew was baseless. And in the eyes of the law, that signature carries legal responsibility regardless of who told her to write it. The fact that she was honest in her deposition may ultimately serve her in one sense. A jury might view her as a reluctant participant rather than an eager aggressor, but reluctant participation in a constitutional violation is still participation. The Fourth Amendment does not contain an exception for officers who feel bad about the arrests they make. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that everything that happened to Marcus Trent, every single event in this chain, was preventable. If Prescott had checked her mirrors before changing lanes, the near collision never happens. If she had not called for backup in a way that framed Marcus as the problem, Galindo never arrives with a biased perspective. If Galindo had asked Prescott what happened before confronting Marcus, he would have learned that Marcus was the aggrieved party, not the aggressor. If either officer had understood the law governing identification demands, the demand never gets made. If Prescott had called her lieutenant, the arrest might never have happened. If Galindo had listened to Prescott when she said she was comfortable letting Marcus go, the handcuffs never go on. At every single junction in this story, there was an off-ramp, a point where someone could have made a different choice and prevented the harm that followed. And at every single junction, the wrong choice was made, not because of one catastrophic failure, but because of a cascade of smaller failures, each one building on the last, each one making the next one more likely. This is how civil rights violations happen in America, not always through dramatic acts of brutality captured on bystander video and broadcast on the evening news. More often, they happen through a quiet accumulation of errors, assumptions, ego, and institutional inertia. They happen when officers prioritize control over legality, when supervisors prioritize authority over accountability, when the chain of command functions as a mechanism for compliance rather than a safeguard against injustice. And they happen to real people, people like Marcus Trent, who was just trying to drive home on a Thursday afternoon. People who were doing nothing wrong, who followed the rules, who knew their rights, and who were punished for it anyway. The depositions in this case pulled back the curtain on exactly how these violations occur and how they are rationalized after the fact. Prescott's testimony showed the reluctant participant, the officer who knew what was happening, was wrong, but did not have the courage to stop it. Galindo's testimony showed the true believer, the officer who could not conceive of a world in which his authority was limited by something as inconvenient as the Constitution. Together, their testimony formed a complete picture of a system failure, not a failure of one bad apple, the tired cliché that police departments and their defenders love to invoke, but a failure of the barrel itself. The barrel that shapes behavior, that rewards compliance, that punishes dissent, that treats civilian rights as obstacles rather than obligations. And the question that hangs over all of it, the question that will eventually be answered by 12 jurors sitting in a federal courtroom in northeastern Ohio, is this: what is the cost of violating someone's constitutional rights? What dollar amount do you assign to the humiliation of being handcuffed for exercising your right to speak and record? What is the value of the principle that says a citizen cannot be arrested for refusing an unlawful demand? The answer to that question will not undo what happened to Marcus Trent. No verdict can turn back time, but it can establish a precedent. It can send a message. It can make the next officer, the next sergeant, the next department think twice before making the same choices that were made on Oakfield Road on that gray October afternoon. And that, ultimately, is why cases like this matter, not just for the individual plaintiff, not just for the specific officers involved, but for everyone who has ever been stopped by a police officer and wondered, in that moment of vulnerability, whether their rights mean anything at all. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention before we close. The question of what happens inside a police department after a case like this goes public and a federal lawsuit is filed. In the Ridgemont Police Department, the fallout from the Marcus Trent arrest was not invisible. The internal affairs investigation into Galindo's conduct suggested that at least some elements within the department recognized that what had happened was problematic. Disciplinary proceedings were initiated. The exact nature of any discipline imposed was not fully disclosed in the deposition testimony covered here, but the fact that an investigation and proceedings occurred at all indicates that the department's leadership saw enough in the evidence to take formal action. But internal discipline, even when it occurs, is often limited in scope and opaque in execution. Suspensions may be measured in days rather than weeks. Reprimands may go into a file that no one outside the department ever sees. And the cultural dynamics that enabled the violation, the hierarchy, the reluctance to challenge, the assumption of civilian guilt, those dynamics survive any individual disciplinary action unless the department undertakes genuine, sustained reform. The off-the-record parking lot meeting that surfaced during Galindo's deposition raised the specter of something even more concerning. It suggested that there were institutional mechanisms for avoiding accountability, established practices for conducting conversations outside the reach of documentation and oversight. If a department has a designated location where officers go to talk without being recorded, what does that tell you about the department's relationship with transparency? What does it tell you about the reliability of official narratives produced by that department? These are not questions with easy answers, and they are not questions that a single federal lawsuit can fully resolve. But they are questions that the Marcus Trent case forces us to confront, because the incident on Oakfield Road was not an isolated event that occurred in a vacuum. It occurred within a departmental culture. It was shaped by institutional norms. And if those norms are not examined and reformed, the next Marcus Trent is not a matter of if, but when. So where does this leave us? A man nearly killed by an officer's reckless driving, an apology that should have ended the encounter, a radio call that reframed the victim as the villain, a sergeant who arrived with conclusions instead of questions, an unlawful demand, a baseless arrest, a charge dismissed within days, and a federal lawsuit that exposed, through the officer's own sworn words, exactly how and why it all went wrong. The case continues to move through the federal court system. Motions are being filed, legal arguments are being sharpened, the possibility of a trial looms on the horizon, and Marcus Trent, the man who just wanted a badge number because someone nearly ran him off the road, waits for the justice system to do what it is supposed to do. Whether that system delivers, whether it holds these officers accountable in a meaningful way, remains to be seen. But the depositions are in the record now, the contradictions are documented, the admissions are under oath. And no amount of courtroom maneuvering can unsay what has already been said. As you sit with this story, I want to leave you with a question. What would you have done in Marcus Trent's position? If an officer nearly caused an accident with your car, apologized for it, and then you found yourself being arrested for standing on a sidewalk with a camera, how would you have responded? Would you have handed over your ID to make it stop, knowing you had no legal obligation to do so? Would you have stood your ground, knowing that handcuffs might follow? Would you have called a lawyer from the sidewalk? Would you have simply driven away after the near miss and never looked back? There is no judgment in any of those answers. Every person calculates risk differently. Every person weighs dignity against safety in their own way. But the fact that we have to make that calculation at all, the fact that a citizen exercising constitutionally protected rights must weigh the probability of being arrested for doing so, tells us something important about the distance between the rights we have on paper and the rights we have on the street. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own rights and how fragile they can be in the face of unchecked authority, subscribe to this channel. We break down cases like this regularly, not to create outrage, but to create understanding. Because knowing your rights is the first step toward protecting them. And protecting them is not just an individual responsibility, it is a collective one. Our rights are not suspended the moment someone with a badge feels uncomfortable. Freedom sometimes requires courage. And sometimes that courage looks like a man standing on a sidewalk with a phone in his hand, asking a simple question that no one wants to answer. What crime have I committed? 7 words. And in this case, the answer was none. The answer was always none.